Hello, everybody. Today I got to talk to Tom Bell, a researcher focused on giant kelp forests and the awesome technology used to track it. Going into the podcast, all I really thought when I thought kelp was SpongeBob and Kelpo's cereal, but Tom has definitely opened my eyes to kelp's importance and the very near future of aquaculture, aqua farming, the full capabilities of using the light spectrum and image processing, and so much about the oceans overall. This was another awesome one, and I'm so glad I got to take up so much of his time. If you like this thing, subscribe on YouTube, follow us on Spotify, connect with us on Instagram or Twitter with that handle Blogo Podcast, or support us on Patreon. Enjoy, guys. Would you want to, I guess, go into your background, where you've worked, what you studied, where you are now, how you got there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up in San Diego, California, near the beach. And so I've always kind of had an interest in the ocean. I did my undergrad at UC Berkeley with a double major in integrated biology and legal studies. At the time, I was interested in being some sort of environmental lawyer.
Good defense lawyer, yeah.
But then I worked for a year or two after college in biotech, making peptide antibodies in Santa Cruz, California. And at that point, I decided to go to grad school. And so this is 2008, so everything was kind of in flux. So I moved back to San Diego and went to San Diego State and got a master's in ecology. And I focused my research on broadly ecosystem ecology. So that's kind of looking at the large scale processes across an entire ecosystem. And so I worked down in Baja California looking at the CO2 flux or carbon dioxide flux over a arid desert ecosystem. And so what we did there was we used these what they're called like eddy covariance or flux towers. And so it's basically a meteorological tower, but at the top it has infrared gas analyzer and the sonic anemometer. So basically just an instrument that tells you the direction of wind using sound waves, but it measures at a really high frequency, so about 10 times per second. And so we were able to examine patterns of CO2 going into the ecosystem through photosynthesis and CO2 leaving the ecosystem through respiration processes, mostly soil respiration across the whole system.
Was there anything, sorry to interrupt, was there anything in specific that led you to like the ecosystem ecology, like when you decided to go back for grad school?
Well, I guess I've just general interest, I suppose, and partly necessity. So I was kind of interested in starting grad school as soon as possible. And there were a few labs that were taking students, but I actually got started in the winter, so the mid in January of that year, which is not the traditional time to get started. And there was a lab with projects ready to go. And I've always been kind of interested in like broad scale patterns, which kind of carried over into my PhD work. And so in 2011, I started my PhD at UC Santa Barbara in Dave Siegel's lab. And so there I kind of started to learn remote sensing. So looking at ecosystem processes using satellite imagery. And I focused on kelp forest systems. So like the picture you can see behind me, that's a drone image of one of our kelp forest sites. And so the kelp, the specific species we're interested in is giant kelp. And so that is a widely distributed, globally distributed species. And what it does is it attaches to the rocky reef as a microscopic gametophyte. There's like a mating process that happens, and then you get this large sporophyte or adult stage, reproductive stage. And so these can be up to 100 feet long and they form this floating surface canopy. And so we were able to observe the dynamics of those surface canopies using satellite imagery, and go back about 35 years, 36 years. And so we created a long time series of canopy biomass dynamics, and we were able to look at what drives those dynamics. And then after that, I did 2 postdocs, one at UCLA and one at University of Alaska. The one at University of Alaska was focused again on remote sensing of kelp, but up in Alaska, looking at how kelp dynamics are reshaped by reintroduction of otters over large scales, and then sea otters. And then in UCLA, we were looking at coral reefs off of Hawaii using a new type of remote sensing that was collected by high altitude aircraft. And so these are,
what was that new type? Yeah.
Yeah, it's called hyperspectral remote sensing. So we can get into that later if we're interested. The difference between the satellites and the hyperspectral.
That's where I'm most excited.
And what's cool about these images is they were NASA and Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, have a few modified U-2 spy planes, kind of left over from the Cold War.
And the U-2 is like the black flat ones that look awesome.
They're like an earlier version of that.
Oh, okay.
So these are what the U.S. used to take surveillance imagery, and they fly at 65,000 feet, so almost kind of at the edge of space. And JPL and NASA were able to put a sensor on these planes, and why they're important is because they fly so high, they have to look through the whole atmospheric column, which kind of is a good simulation for satellite data, because satellite data is always going to have to look through all the atmospheric column. And so it was a test bed for a new satellite that is most likely going to launch around 2025 or 2026.
Oh, that's cool.
And so we're looking at, kind of being able to see what we can do with the imagery in regards to coral reefs. And then since then, starting around 2017 or 18, I became a researcher at UC Santa Barbara in the Earth Research Institute. And we got a large grant from the Department of Energy to look at the ability of autonomous systems, so like drones, both aerial and underwater drones, to monitor offshore aquaculture. And I have a few more projects. I'm actually leaving UCSB in April to start as a scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts. And so that pretty much takes you to where I am right now.
Well, that'll be even better when I want to talk to you. When we want to talk next time, you'll be on Eastern time.
Oh yeah. You won't see this angle of sunlight coming through my window.
But yeah, back to I was gonna phrase it in the way like what kept you with kelp, but honestly, I guess a better way to phrase it is tell the world what is important about kelp. Like the reason, it's important to understand the reason it's important to understand how it's present in the ecosystem. The importance of tracking and the things you do.
Yeah. So I guess in regards to my specific research interests, I'm interested in kelp both as a natural ecosystem structuring species and as a potential aquaculture species. So giant kelp forests are globally distributed, and they're off the coast of California all the way up to Alaska and Baja California, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and Chile and Argentina, and then some of the sub-Antarctic islands as well. And it is known as a foundation species. So basically its presence can have pretty immense effects on the associated community. So if you think about it, it's attached to a subtidal rocky reef. So, anywhere between 5 and 30 meters of depth. And then the organism has these fronds. And so each frond has a bunch of blades. And so the fronds you can kind of think of as the stems or the trunk. And the blades are kind of like the leaves. Even though giant kelp isn't technically a plant, it's algae or macroalgae. And at the base of each one of these blades is a little gas bladder called a pneumaticist. And so that provides buoyancy to kind of buoy the fronds up to the surface and create the surface canopy. And in the process, it creates all this structure throughout the water column, and that provides habitat for a multitude of species. Yeah. And so, when you're in a kelp forest, you might see completely different types and amounts of species that you wouldn't see outside of a kelp forest. They're also very dynamic. So like for instance, on the central coast of California, so kind of like between Point Conception, which is just kind of northwest of where I am, and up to, Monterey or Santa Cruz, it's a very exposed coastline. And so they get large waves and swell every winter. They also have a lot of nutrient upwelling. So upwelling is the process of high nutrient cold water that moves towards the shoreline, and that fuels the growth and production of kelp. And we can get into the physics of that later if you want.
I would love to. Yeah. Is the cold water significant?
Yeah. So basically, what happens along the coast of California is we have these prevailing northwest winds. So they come from the northwest. And if you're familiar with the geography of California, it's on the west coast of the United States, and it's kind of oriented north to south and a little bit northwest to southeast. And the wind comes down along the coast. And so you think that it just pushes the water from north to south in the same direction, but the rotation of the earth has this Coriolis effect. And so the mean direction of the water will actually be 90 degrees to the wind. So the water will want to move in the same direction of the wind, but as the earth rotates, it pushes the water offshore. And as the surface water moves offshore, there has to be water that comes to replace it. And so what happens is this deep water, which is usually from like cold, dark places of the ocean, and has a lot of nutrients, comes up along the shore to replace that water that was moved offshore on the surface. And so that brings nutrients up to the coast, and that's what fuels the growth of kelp.
That's really cool to visualize.
But this upwelling, varies in magnitude throughout the year with the strength of the wind. And so we typically get high upwelling in the spring and summer. And then that's when we see the big growth of kelp. And then we typically get large waves in the winter, fall and winter, and then those rip up the kelp. And so you'll see this huge regrowth and huge decline of kelp along Central California almost every year. In Southern California, it's a little different because we're protected from these large waves for the most part. But we'll get these more interannual oscillations of kelp. So we'll see a lot of kelp for a few years, and then not much kelp for another few years. And that seems to be related to these larger scale ocean climate processes, which change the amounts and source waters of this upwelled water. So we'll get periods where it's very nutrient rich in the Southern California bight, and periods where it's very nutrient poor. And we kind of see kelp follow that. And what's kind of concerning about kelp forests is there's been reports of kelp forests being lost around the world. Some of that is related to these natural climate processes, these decadal processes where you get a lot of kelp for a few years and no kelp for a few years. And I think there's a lot more to explore there. But there's also evidence that climate change is affecting it, especially in Tasmania and southeastern Australia. We've had a large-scale change of currents, and we've seen huge reductions of kelp. And along Northern California, a different species of kelp, which is called bull kelp, but kind of acts in a very similar way to giant kelp. We've seen really dramatic declines of that species since about 2014 without much recovery since then. So that's also concerning. And we have a new project to look at that, what happened up there.
And is that is the, I guess, species differentiation between like kelp, like bull kelp, compared to what was the other kind?
The giant kelp.
Giant kelp, yeah. Is the main like difference in the importance of tracking them that it hosts different kinds of species in like the ecosystem that creates, or
they do, but it's probably more related to the geography of where they exist. We typically get bull kelp in cooler, more exposed areas. We don't really see bull kelp in Southern California at all. There's some mix in Central California, and then in Northern California, it's almost exclusively bull kelp. And then, as you go north and the waters get cooler, you tend to get different species. But so yeah, you'll see different types of species. You'll see some of the same species too.
Yeah, so it's about where it can inhabit. Yeah, we want kelp everywhere. That's one thing I definitely had to mention is looking through, because I was looking obviously through your website, and I love seeing the articles and papers that have come out. But I think kelp has to take the cake with the most fun names.
Oh yeah, all the
kelp,
all the headlines, kelp help, and
right?
yeah.
I love it. They're all like, that's so funny.
Yeah. A lot of the press releases go through our, public affairs office at UCSB or other, and they have a whole team that's devoted to
thinking of kelp,
write up and make these catchy titles. Yeah.
That's so funny. Yeah. But yeah, what was I going to ask? Is there a reason you said in Tasmania it's particularly affected from? You seem to say like climate change, like the currents changed around there.
Yeah, I haven't. I've done limited of my own work there, but from what I've read from other published papers, and there's a large Tasmanian and Australian team that is focused on these questions that do great work. I think that's probably the most clear-cut case of seeing kind of larger scale oceanographic changes that have been associated with climate change and how that can affect, coastal subtidal ecosystems. And so there's giant kelp there. There's a lot less now than there used to be. And there's been work even going back and looking at historical navigation maps. So like British Navy maps from the 1850s to kind of see where kelp was marked on those maps, and then go back to those sites to see, is there any kelp here anymore? And we've done a little bit of work, haven't published any of it, but to look at satellite imagery going back to the early 80s, and there has been a decrease in kelp cover in the satellite time series in Tasmania. And so that basically the current along the coast of Tasmania has changed, where you get basically more often, you'll get more warm water influence coming from the north. This is in, the southern hemisphere, and less cool water influence coming from near Antarctica. And there's nutrient changes there, kind of like here, where warm water typically has less nutrients. It's more tropical water, and the cool water has more nutrients, and it looks like that's having fairly large effects.
Yeah, that's wild. I never heard about that like specific, I guess, instance.
There's also, potential effects of overfishing. There's, if you've heard of like sea urchins, which are like I suppose most people know what a sea urchin is, but it's this little invertebrate. It's covered in spikes, and it eats kelp and other things on the rocky reef, and they can increase in densities and create these kind of barren areas. And there has been some evidence of overfishing of sea urchin predators, which may lead to these increased, sustain these increased densities.
So interesting. Yeah. There's one of the people I talked to um, a couple weeks ago. She's like a deep sea ecologist. Like she works with like deep sea sponges. But like one of the like later on, we were just talking about like climate change things and kind of way and some of just the biggest threats to the ocean. And one that she explained to me that I personally hadn't heard of before was like the existence of like oxygen dead zones,
Mm-hmm.
like being tied to like runoff and everything from agriculture. And I was asking her like, I'm definitely going to ask you later as well. But when we're talking about some of these issues, if hypothetically you had like whatever X amount of money, $1 billion, and someone gave you that money to to fix that problem, like what you would do. And one of the things she mentioned in terms of like short term helping with, because she picked like the oxygen dead zone thing to attack, um, that you could use something like kelp, I think she mentioned, to make any of those bays or any areas that have high runoff, to like kind of like line them out with kelp, because it
Mm-hmm.
would take out kind of that nutrient density before it goes into like the deep ocean, and like the bacteria causes that that oxygen dead zone.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I definitely want to bring that up to get your thoughts on that idea. Anyways, yeah, your thoughts on it. Anyways, you'd expand on it. I think the ways you think it would work.
Well, yeah. So
Really
kelp
cool
would
idea, yeah.
remove nutrients, and also by growing and the photosynthetic process add oxygen
Hmm.
back to the water. Um, to do something like that, it would have to be you'd have to have a lot, this $1 billion you were talking
Yeah,
about, to not only research it but to create something that's large enough to do it. There's been
yeah. Are
there's a
there any?
trash there's a trash truck coming down the street right now, so if it gets loud for a second,
Oh,
just
okay.
I apologize. But if yeah, there's been evidence of kelp aquaculture and kelp forests um, having a measurable effect at taking out nutrients, but it's related to um, basically the residence time of the water in
Hmm.
the kelp forest. So on the coast of California, where we work, we don't see a large effect of nutrient drawdown from natural kelp forests, but the currents coming through them make the residence time in of any parcel of water going through the kelp forest only be, on the order of minutes. So there's just not enough time. But
Yeah,
if you were to put this in a bay
that's an interesting
or
factor.
something,
Yeah.
and have a large enough area that you're growing it in, um, yeah, it could draw down nutrients. I mean, there's some work going on at the university, or actually at Bigelow Marine Lab, I think up in Maine, that has shown some evidence of aquaculture sites, kelp aquaculture sites removing nutrients when the currents are slow.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's like probably the biggest factor is how quickly, yeah, the water's going to sift through there.
How much time you give the kelp
Yeah,
to
exactly.
work, basically. Yeah.
The size of the kelp forest.
Yeah, and increasing a kelp forest, like if you were to put this in kind of an aquaculture setting and build like a large kelp farm, right, where you grow kelp, um, increasing the area of that, the the water as it moves through a longer area is going to keep slowing down, and it would be kind of a balancing act. I suppose if the water is really eutrophied and has a lot of nutrients in it, um, you get nutrient drawdown, but not so much so that the kelp in the middle would be starved of nutrients. But it would be kind of like a balancing act of, you don't want to get to the point where the water slows down so much that it strips all the nutrients out of the water before, if you're trying to grow the kelp, you know.
Yeah.
Um, but I guess in that context, you'd probably have the kelp there just to strip the nutrients out of the water, so it wouldn't really matter.
Yeah, yeah. That's so cool thing about all the aspects of this though. Um, I think I just had some other questions on there. Yeah, what are the bigger like other initiatives like that right now, kind of focusing on kelp? I mean more so not research, but like yeah, either companies or yeah, just initiatives
Mm-hmm.
trying to
So,
utilize kelp like that or
so this
harvest.
kind of relates to the big
What does it mean?
project with Department of Energy
Hmm.
we have right now. It's through what's called ARPA-E. It's basically advanced research projects energy.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of like, if you're familiar with DARPA, through the Department of Defense, kind of like, it's basically Department of Energy's version of that. So it's these ideas and projects that are too risky for the private sector to invest in at this point. So there's been some, funding for academic research and some private companies to examine um, the future of kelp aquaculture in an offshore setting. So this means outside of state waters and federal waters. And here specifically, it means about 3 miles off the coast.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a bunch of problems to deal with there. Deep water. How do you anchor a farm? Do you anchor a farm? Is it free floating?
Yeah.
The water tends to be a little
Free floating.
potentially. There's a bunch of problems with that: navigational hazards, entanglement of marine species.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a host of issues, but at this point, it's basically, looking at the fundamental research questions behind doing something like that. Doing selective breeding, which kelp can tolerate the lower nutrient conditions offshore, which may have some knock-on effects for, kelp restoration of natural systems. We're focused on monitoring. So can we use autonomous vehicles and sensors to monitor the farms?
Mm-hmm.
So there doesn't need to be humans on the farm, which most people probably wouldn't want to, be out 3 miles out, 3+ miles out in the ocean for months at a time. And so what we're interested in doing is looking at, what affects the growth of kelp, how, what commercially available or developing sensors can tell you about the amount of biomass at the surface, the physiological condition of kelp. So like what's the nitrogen content of the surface canopy, what's the sugar content of the surface canopy, and then underwater vehicles tell you about outplant success, growth rate, and how they're developing underwater. And the reason that Department of Energy is interested in this, so like, what does Department of Energy have to do with kelp, is that back in 2012, there was a paper that was the cover of Science magazine, which showed that you can take tissue from giant kelp, which we've been talking about, and efficiently convert it to ethanol. And I think it's over twice as efficient as corn.
Mm-hmm. So for things like fuel cells and just any use of ethanol, that could be really useful.
Basic kind of fermentation of kelp into alcohol, right? And then using alcohol as a sustainable fuel.
Yeah.
Especially as a liquid fuel, as we move a lot of transportation to electric cells. There's always going to be some need for liquid fuel, and there's going to be some things that electric, having heavy batteries isn't going to allow you to do. So this paper in 2012 found that if you balance the 3 major sugars in kelp tissue at the right ratios, you can produce ethanol at a much higher efficiency than corn. And giant kelp is also the fastest growing marine species. So it can grow, people say up to 1 meter a day. Really, it's more like, under good conditions, probably like 1 foot a day. But that's, you can almost watch it grow. And there's a high turnover. So you'll have fronds initiate. So new fronds come up from the base of the plant, and they'll grow up to the surface, and their lifespan will be about 100 days, and then they'll drop off naturally. And so if you were to manage this biomass turnover or manage your harvesting correctly, you can pull, a lot of kelp. And if you can do it cheaply without a lot of labor costs, then it would be something that would be tenable for biofuel production.
Yeah.
And so we've
that'd be a huge change if the U.S. or just like the world switched from getting their ethanol from corn mostly too.
Yeah, and it's not just from changing a source or making a more efficient source, it's also about freeing up land for agriculture. You
Yeah.
know, a lot we're growing food products that
Yeah.
we're using for fuel and not eating, right? And as the world population grows, we're going to need more arable land for growing, and also for water use, and fertilizer use. So if you know, kelp doesn't need fresh water. It has an abundance of water around it all the time, and if we can manage these natural upwelling processes for growth and harvest, we wouldn't need to apply fertilizer.
Mm-hmm. That's actually really awesome. That's huge. That's so many things.
Yeah, it's a lot of pluses. You know, there's always things to, you know, consider, that negatives of it, and
Yeah.
you know, I think,
Like you're mentioning in terms of putting it, like trying to move it out towards deeper sea.
yeah, you know, I think there's a lot of engineering that still has to happen here.
Yeah.
And then you always have to worry about marine entanglement issues. You know, if these are traditional kind of rope line farms, you know, putting them in areas where you have lower risk of marine entanglement, or developing other ways to prevent that from happening. We don't want, you know, large whales being entangled in kelp farms. I don't think anybody wants that. So
random timing. My last guest, Martin Haulena. I talked to him last week, but he literally, like, he works out of the Vancouver Aquarium. He's like the lead there. But like that's literally what he and his teams do, is like save entangled animals.
oh wow,
Exactly what we're
nice.
talking about now.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, they in the last like decades really improved like the anesthetic protocols and everything, so you could do that out in the field.
nice. Yeah, I worked with a guy in Hawaii who, when we were doing our surveys of coral reefs simultaneous to the overflights of the hyperspectral sensor, we worked with a whale watching group out of where were we? We were in Maui, and in Lahaina, and they use some of their income from whale watching to provide kind of transportation and boating services to researchers for free. And he also did a lot of work with like humpback whale entanglement. So he was one of the rapid response crew. So if a whale was seen that had a rope tied around it, he was trained to, and a whole team to go out and remove that entanglement.
Yeah, what a wild, cool job. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's and he told me all about it. It can be pretty dangerous too. If you could, you know.
Oh, I bet. Yeah, that's pretty wild. Yeah, I don't even get how. Yeah, that's even like a more niche one. I don't do. I mean, I don't know how much you know about him and like that role. Does that base itself off like like a veterinary path? Did he have to go through that path to get in that role, or was it?
Well, I met. I mean, he's a captain of a whale watching skiff, right? But you know, I forgot how many whales that he's saved or, you know, removed ropes or nets from, but it's all been, you know, with the association of veterinarians and marine biologists who may be on the boat when they go out and do it too. So
yeah,
actually, I'm just going to close my curtain real quick because the sun's starting to hit in.
Yeah. Much better. Yeah.
Okay, that's a little bit better.
Yeah, it's out of your face. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are, so like, other than the threat to like marine animals getting entangled, are there other kind of things they're worried about? Things that they're worried they could happen if they try to basically take advantage of deeper sea water to displace agriculture, kind of, or like move the kelp there so they can farm it?
Well, you know, any type of increased industrialization of offshore systems is going to bring a host of problems. You're probably going to have, you know, the more time you spend out there, the more potential marine debris you can leave. There's big issues with, large waves, like I mentioned before, which only increase as you move offshore. So, if those were to break up the farms, and they sink down to the bottom, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Increased shipping. One of the cool projects that's come out of this so far is that a group has made an autonomous tugboat, which is very efficient, and it basically can theoretically pull a large harvested amount of kelp through the water, and it basically has one large propeller, or maybe two large propellers, but it moves at kind of a very slow rate of speed, which is fine when you don't have people on it. So no one's kind of rushing to get home for dinner. And it uses, I think right now it is still fuel based, but it uses it's very efficient. Other issues, navigational issues. The whole project is focused on not adding fertilizer to the water. But if people were to start fertilizing, that would be a big issue. Adding
fertilizing.
Like if they were to start adding nitrogen to the water.
Okay, just the water nitrogen levels.
Yeah, like if people were to grow kelp and fertilize kelp the same way we fertilize conventional agriculture, by just dumping, it would be less effective because obviously the water is going to move that fertilizer away as it comes through. But we don't want to be dumping any more nitrogen fertilizers into the ocean as we already are. But we're focused on trying to find ways to not artificially fertilize, to put, whether it is finding the right sites where we have natural upwelling in an offshore area. And we had a paper that came out on that last year. It was led by our technician, Jordan Schneider, or whether it is timing the growth and harvest to coincide with upwelling processes. So that's, I think there might be some ways around it, but I think that there's a lot of engineering challenges that are still to be solved.
That's the coolest part. Yeah. So cool having those to face. Well, I think you might have mentioned it before, but is the best way to track upwelling based on like how much growth occurs after it upwells? Is that how you're tracking how much of an upwelling was?
There's a few ways to do it. Traditionally, there's been these indices or upwelling indices, which are based on wind, which do tell you whether or not, it's physics based. It does tell you like whether water's upwelling or not. What it doesn't necessarily tell you is the kinds of water that are being upwelled. So you may have upwelling favorable winds in the fall or in the late summer, but if the water is highly stratified and you have a large layer of warm, nutrient poor water on the surface, you may have upwelling happening, but it only may be upwelling that warm water with low nutrients. So what we use, there's no perfect method other than having a bunch of temperature sensors in the water, but it's hard to do that over large areas. You may have one at like a pier, but you can't put those. There's a good buoy system that the United States runs, National Buoy Data Center. We typically use satellite imagery of sea surface temperature. And that doesn't always work perfect. It works very well, but there's some situations where you might have warm water that's stratified, and there could be upwelling processes happening just below that stratified layer that you're not seeing. But typically what we found is that daily sea surface temperature imagery works well for mapping the spatial and temporal patterns of nutrient upwelling. And so if you think about
daily, like you wouldn't need crazy fast feedback, right?
I mean, the more resolution you have, the better. The reason why daily sea surface temperature is so useful is because coastal waters can be very cloudy. And so you want to have a daily or twice daily satellite overpass to try to get you an image of sea surface temperature, so you have a better chance at, you know, seeing the ocean when it's not cloudy. So a lot of these sensors don't work if there's clouds, right? We'll only see the top of the clouds from the satellites, and we'll lose information about what's happening below it. So,
but in terms of let's say the thing gathering your sea temperature data is accurate, you don't need a smaller window than a day. Really, there's not that many changes that are happening where you need like hourly.
There are, but you know, upwelling processes, what we're interested in, typically happen over several days, to weeks or even months. So that's what we're interested in. There's shorter, you know, higher frequency processes happening on the, you know, diurnal, like a daily scale, or semi-diurnal, like multiple times a day, that are related to both tides and internal waves. But you know, if you can pick those up on temperature sensors within a kelp forest, that you'll see these pulses of nutrients throughout the day. But really what we're interested in is, you know, if you think of a day as like this long, you'll see these pulse, but we're not really interested in those small pulses, at least for these projects. We're interested whether they're like, it's a high nutrient pulse or like a low nutrient pulse. And that seems to be associated with whether upwelling is happening or not.
Gotcha. Yeah, the reason I'm asking is, and I keep kind of, I guess, foreshadowing, the thing I'm super just interested in general is, especially with like the robotics, drones, automation, and to kind of the when I really thought about it, when I really started thinking about it like a while ago, like at least a year ago now, but kind of why I started this whole thing to try to learn much more about it. But the amount of things you could do with that in the ocean is like too crazy. Like the amount of things drones would be useful for. Like if you're looking forward to a future where, let's say you make it a given that you're gonna have like automated drones that can do different functions. So like that's like a new one, to at least for me, that I never thought about. And I never knew we had kind of a or the buoy like association. What was the
National Buoy, National Data Buoy Center, NDBC. Yeah, and you can look it up. All the data is public.
Yeah, but
global array of buoys.
Yeah, and like as soon as you said that, I was like, that'd be cool. Not even cool, but super useful if an approach to that in the future would be to literally have, let's say, just like a mile offshore, every mile around like the US, you have like where it would be, you should have like a drone that just stays locked, and that GPS coordinate just goes up and down through the day, getting like data points of temperature. So you have all points of.
So there's almost something that kind of exists like that right now.
Just like that?
Well, so there's these things. Have you heard of Argos floats?
No.
So I think they're created at Mbari, which is a research institute up in Monterey Bay. And so they're basically drifters, but they're these long cylinders, and they don't cost all that much. I think only, you know, several $1,000s a piece, depending on the instrumentation they have on them. And they've created a network of countries around the world that have funded this. And there's quite a few. And so they will drop these floats off of research vessels, from airplanes, from recreational vessels that partner with them, that are like, I'm sailing across the Pacific, you know, and they're like, can you drop this float at this point, you know, when you're somewhere in the Pacific? So they just drop off the side of the boat. And so what it will do is, you know, float, and then it will change its buoyancy so that it drops down. And as it drops down, or as it comes back up. I'm not sure in which direction it takes the measurements, but all the sensors will basically take a profile of temperature, salinity, pressure, which are the typical three main ones you measure in the ocean, but also things like nitrate concentration, pH or alkalinity, to look at oxygen levels, all these different variables. And as it comes up to the surface, it will then, stick its head out of the water and then beam that data to a satellite and then beam it back to shore. And so they'll just basically drift around the ocean on the currents, taking profiles, and they operate for several years. And so there's, I think,
go ahead. Yeah, sorry, continue.
Typically like thousands of these out at any time. And so outside of the buoys, we're getting a wealth of information just of what's happening along the ocean currents by these floats and drifters.
Yeah, that's super cool. I definitely did not know those exist. But yeah, that's basically the thing I just mentioned. It just without the locomotive automation component, like it can't change where it is. But yeah, just going up and down, collecting all the data you need, and then they don't recharge themselves. They last for a while because it's low energy. That's super cool though. Those exist at all.
Yeah. We're kind of trying to do something like that with kelp forests, both in the aquaculture and natural sense. So, we'd like, ideally, what I'd like to do is have some sort of platform, even if it's on land. Like if I was interested in monitoring this kelp forest here, you could see the beach up in the kind of upper part of this image, right? And so just behind that beach is a cliff. And so up on the cliff, if you had, I've seen a couple of these prototypes of these kind of drone launching platforms, and you can kind of think some of them look like a Weber grill, kind of, like a big dome. And at a certain time each day, if the weather conditions are good, it could open up, drone would fly out, survey the kelp forest with whatever sensors you have on the drone, come back, land in it, it would close, the data would downlink from the drone would recharge.
Yeah.
And so you get these kind of aerial maps. This one behind me I took with the Phantom 4 Pro, so your typical like higher end consumer drone, which has a 20 megapixel color camera. But yesterday I was flying with a sensor, it's a multispectral sensor, so you get calibrated reflectance in different color bands and in parts of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can't see, like the near infrared, and also the thermal. And then we have a hyperspectral drone sensor on a drone as well. So, products we can get from these, from a single pass, we can get cover, we can get biomass, we can get nitrogen content of the actual tissue.
Is that based off the thermal readout?
It's based off of we made an algorithm with looking at two different spectral bands, one that's in the red part of the spectrum and one that's in the orange part of the spectrum. And so chlorophyll A, which is in, I think, all plants and most algae, is the main light harvesting pigment for photosynthesis. And that absorbs light in the red and the blue. And so if you've ever seen those plant lights that look kind of purple, I think they're pretty popular these days, like grow lights or something. There's like my neighbor, it grows these like palm trees and indoor house plants. And at night, it looks like her house is like a disco or something, because there's these like really bright pink lights coming out.
That's cool.
And so the high efficiency lights now, basically, if you look at them, they're like red and blue LEDs. And so they don't even emit green light, because green light's not absorbed by plants for photosynthesis. And that's why plants look green, because they're reflecting green light back and taking all the red and the blue for photosynthesis. So what we do with this in the red part of the spectrum, if you were to look at the reflectance, so the light is coming in as white light, or the solar spectrum, and it basically takes red light out. But as you move towards the green, there's more light coming back at you. And so we found two wavelengths where if you compare those two wavelengths, how much red light is being absorbed
And how much?
versus how much orange light's being absorbed.
Oh, okay.
And that tells you how much chlorophyll is in the plant
That's really
or in the algae. And it also tells you how much nitrogen is in and is in the tissue. And what we're working on now is doing field experiments to examine how the mannitol, which is one of the important kelp sugars needed for ethanol production, changes throughout the year, and how that's related to nitrogen content and chlorophyll content and nutrients and the available light to make another algorithm from reflectance to tell us how much mannitol is in the canopy. And so if we had a drone with those right spectral bands, carrying a sensor with those right spectral bands, we can get these maps created probably within 10 or 15 minutes from the drone imagery that'll tell you everything you need to know about the health of the kelp, how much of the kelp's there, if it's in an aquaculture setting, should we harvest now, should we harvest later?
Are there any metrics that you can't get right now from aerial drones, like in terms of imagery? Like, are there any, like you said, you can see the chlorophyll level, you can see the nitrogen level and mannitol level through like these kind of algorithms you guys have made from the data you do have. Are there any things you can't track from those kinds of data you're collecting? Like, would you need any underwater ones at all?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So we're really interested in this floating canopy. And as the kelp moves underwater, the kelp forest you see behind me, that was taken on about the clearest water day you're ever going to find in California, where you can see down to the bottom. Usually you can't see, you can only see a few feet down, right, from aerial view. And as the light comes, goes through the water and comes back, the water is going to change the reflectance quite a bit of the water of the spectrum. So you're going to start losing these. Excuse me. You're going to start losing these lower wavelength parts of the spectrum. So the near infrared, the red's going to go. If you've ever been scuba diving and you drop down, 40 or 50 feet, and you take like a color card with you, like just goes like the rainbow of colors, you'll start to, as you drop down, you'll see, the red, the orange, the yellow, all go away. You won't be able to see them anymore. They'll kind of look
color
black.
card reacting based on how much light is getting to that depth.
Yeah. So like, when you look at the color red, you need red light to be bounced back, to interpret it. But as the water absorbs those colors of light very strongly. And so, like a red sea urchin, when you're diving on a reef, looks like a black sea urchin. Then you take it up to the surface and it looks red. And so you have to account for those changes. And when we were doing our coral reef work, we modeled thousands of different combinations of water columns in this radiative transfer model to look at, like, if you had this much sediment in the water and this much chlorophyll from phytoplankton in the water, and the water was this deep, and you had this much wind speed, how would that reflectance spectrum you're measuring from a satellite change over a coral reef, which also has a reflectance that's based on the pigments in the coral reef and the structure of the coral reef. So we are doing underwater work. It's basically our grants divided into two separate, like, different realms. I'm in charge of the aerial and satellite realm, and then Nick Nizico at UCSB, who's a physical oceanographer and also works with autonomous systems, is leading the underwater part. And so there, we started by looking at side scan sonar from boats, and we just got a what's called like a small underwater autonomous vehicle from the Navy to test out sonar. So it's about like 3 feet long. It looks like a little torpedo. And we also have been doing ROV work. So it's remotely operated vehicles, which are attached to the boat, but are underwater.
Like rovers kind of thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that carries a stereo camera. So it's basically 2 color cameras that are a known distance apart. So you can do structure for motion. So you can estimate basically depth of field. And we've been doing machine learning classification on those color images as well. And if the water's clear enough, if the water's clear, oh, sorry, I'm back. The internet is terrible here.
I don't know. You didn't freeze. I thought you thought I froze. Or like I thought, yeah.
If the water's clear enough, you can, successfully run these deep learning, machine learning algorithms on the color imagery to classify mostly kind of the small scale. So like if we were to go out and seed a farm and you wanted to say, a month later, how many of my, how well is the kelp growing? Did it grow at all? Did some herbivore come and eat all the baby, young kelp? Or are they looking okay? Or are they damaged? Or, and so basically running an autonomous vehicle along the lines, taking color imagery and, processing that color imagery really quickly, and then pairing it with the location data from the vehicle to tell you, to make a map of like, here's a kelp out plant, here's a kelp out plant, here's a kelp out plant, and how has it changed since the last time we saw it.
That's so then, I guess just thinking about it with no information, I would think if there was an underwater like drone system, the things they would be monitoring wouldn't be the color imagery, but it'd be like some kind of thing in the water, like how much something from the water to gauge where they're
yeah.
That's interesting knowing that it'd be that underwater one is still going based off of color imagery.
Yeah, so you have to have the right ocean conditions for it. We typically have conditions that'll work for that along the coast. Here maybe half the time. In the offshore context, it'll be more often because there's less nutrients. The water tends to be clear out there. But what you can do more often is use acoustic imagery. And so that's where the side scan sonar comes in. And what's cool about the kelp, especially the giant kelp, it's like I told you at the beginning, each blade, or kind of analogous to a leaf, has that gas bladder on it, this little like bubble basically, that like a drum creates a very high acoustic return. So, and we know that for each gas bladder, there's a blade, and then most of the biomass is those blades. So if you have 50,000 returns, or like a very bright return, that there's more biomass there. And so when you start getting to anything above, 3 feet in length, it's more, it's probably better to use that acoustic imagery. And it cuts through that you can do it, and you don't need it to be daylight, and you can do it under most water conditions.
Is there anything, that would take water condition out of the equation that can get you those measurements of, like you said, the chlorophyll, the what was the M1, the sugar? What are the three?
Mannitol.
Mannitol, yeah.
Yeah.
What are the other two of the main sugars other than that one?
There's laminarin.
Laminarin.
And then there's alginate.
Okay.
Or like which is the most abundant sugar. And if you've ever held, or if you go to the beach on the West Coast and you see kelp on the beach, or you go and grab some out of the water, it immediately it can get very slimy. And so it's always producing this kind of like mucus, which are these like carbohydrates. And so it's growing so fast, it's like sloughing off material. And so you can feel that alginate. And actually that's the main reason why kelp has been harvested for a long time.
It's just that sugar.
So Yeah, there's not a lot of kelp harvesting going on in California. There used to be, I think from the 650s to the 90s, there was a big company based out of San Diego called Kelco, which had this kind of giant lawnmower ship, which would go and cut the canopy off the kelp. And because kelp grows from the reef, it would, we've looked at decades of satellite imagery, and we have all the Kelco records, which they gave to UCSB. So we know where they harvested and how much they harvested. And we can see very short-term effects of harvesting. So like for a week, we see a decrease in kelp canopy and it's back the next week. But they harvested kelp for the alginate to use in different food and cosmetic products and pharmaceutical products. And I think they moved most of their operations to Ireland.
Why is that? Why would they move to Ireland?
I think the regulatory environment of California was a little too much.
Oh, okay. What regulation could have bothered them? Like what in that process they were doing was hurting the kelp or the ecosystem?
I don't think there's been a lot of evidence to show that any of the kelp harvesting had a negative effect on the kelp itself, but there is a whole community of organisms that live in the canopy. If you harvest the canopy, if anything's not fast enough to get out of the way, you're going to harvest those organisms as well. I think there's been a movement to protect the coast of California, which is a good thing overall. There's still some kelp harvesting that happens in California. Some of it here, it's on a very small scale. A lot of it's to feed abalone. So there's some onshore abalone farms.
What is abalone?
Abalone is like this kind of mollusk. It looks like a big snail almost, but it's basically a shell, and then the animal is under the shell. So if you pick it up, it's like if you got a cereal bowl and you turn it upside down on the reef. And they used to be very abundant. Apparently people think they taste good. I'm sure they do. I've never really had much of an opportunity to eat one. My dad tells me that they used to serve them in restaurants in the 70s. They were pretty much off the dinner plate by the time I came around. Due to overharvesting, there's also been a disease. So now they still grow abalone on farms at a very small scale, because obviously it's kind of hard to find. But their main food is kelp. There actually is still some abalone harvesting there was abalone harvesting on the north coast of California up until 2016 or so, because the kelp declined up there, like I told you about earlier, and that has decimated the abalone populations even more. So they're under a lot of stress. So the state closed any sort of harvesting of abalone in Southern and Central California a long time ago. I'm not exactly sure of the year, but probably most of my lifetime. And they closed the harvesting, recreational and commercial harvesting. I'm not sure there was ever any commercial harvesting, but any recreational harvesting of abalone in 2016 or 2017 after the decline of the kelp forest. There's a chance if and when the kelp forest comes back, the abalone populations could rebound and there could be recreational harvesting again. I don't really eat much abalone, like I told you. So that's not my main priority. But
how many things at any given moment, like if you literally had to count them, how many things are being harvested by humans? Like anything out there.
Anything, yeah. I mean, that's what we do, right?
Collect snails. Someone trying to collect random fungus. Someone trying to collect wild.
I mean,
there was a number, just like a website where you go to it and there's like a little flip counter number of how many things you're harvesting right now.
I mean, almost everything. If you philosophically, I guess it's kind of what we do, right?
Yeah.
And we're in a sense, like most, a lot of organisms, we're consumers and we're just always consuming, right?
Yeah.
That's how to consume in the way that doesn't hurt the planet.
Yeah.
You know,
Figure out how to, any new thing we come into contact with, we're gonna find a way to use it. Like,
yeah, and we have thumbs and a brain, so
yeah,
we'll probably figure out some way to do
exactly.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, I just never gotten that visual until like I started like when you were talking about that baloney, I was literally just imagining like someone on the beach trying to get them, and I'm like, wow, we're literally trying to get everything.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to wade into the intertidal and stick your hand under a rock and pry it off, or sometimes you have to free dive down to a reef 30 or 40 feet deep to get it. But
yeah,
it's it's dangerous too. People, back when there's recreational harvesting, people would die every year harvesting these snails.
Yeah, that's so wild. That's something like you mentioned scuba diving before. I've never gone scuba diving, and I definitely want to. But like this makes me think of the like spearfishing, how wild that is.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah,
have you ever done that, or do you know much about that?
I've been with people while they've been doing it, but
Yeah.
I've never done it. But I've went out with a friend of mine in La Jolla, and I basically floated at the surface in the kelp forest and watched him, and it was kind of amazing how long he could stay down, and then kind of see him like dive down and just like remain still. He had a camouflage wetsuit on, and kind of sneak up on fish. It's pretty nuts.
So is it because I know I was introduced from like another podcast about this one girl, I forget her name, but I just follow her on Instagram. This lady that's like a really famous spear fisherman now. But like I didn't even know that was like you getting paid to catch certain things, or is it like, or like I didn't understand if her like account is just like she takes really cool visuals of it, so it's more of just like she became known for it and just has enough followers where it's a thing. But I was like, is there market for that? Like really specific spear fishing?
Well, I mean, I think most of the people I know that do it recreationally, just for fun. And
maybe it was just that. Maybe she just really got really into it, and then she got like really. She was famous for something else. I don't know. But yeah.
But there's a lot of people around the world that in a lot of places I've done research in French Polynesia or Hawaii, that's like part of subsistence. Like they've been doing that for a long time. Their parents and grandparents and their parents all, when they wanted something to eat that night, they went out in the reef and spearfish.
That's what I understand. Yeah, and I love, or like that's such a cool, like that's how certain like places have always done it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was confusing when I saw her account. I was like, "What is this?" Like, what?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good way to get in, to become part of a system.
Yeah,
like an ecosystem in a way, or to observe it in a way. I know I scuba dive, to do work, but scuba diving, while you can stay down there for a little while, it's you're carrying a bunch of stuff, you're making a bunch of noise, there's bubbles, right? So I've never done a lot of free diving, but I have a lot of friends that do free diving, and they tell me that, who do both, both scuba diving and free diving, they tell me that it's a different experience to be down there, to be quiet, to spend some time in a system where you're really not supposed to be, and to feel like you're part of it. So I could see the appeal of that.
Yeah, that's so cool.
It's just amazing how long people can hold their breath. When I didn't really have to ever really think about that too much until I took my scientific diving class, and swimming the width of a pool underwater without coming up at all, which is like one of the basic like swim test things you have to do. Or then
lifeguard, right?
Yeah, or like putting on some fins and going to the diving well of a pool. And we do this thing where we have these things called lift bags. So like they're bags that if you need to lift something that's heavy from an underwater environment, you attach the lift bag to it, and then you like add air from your tank until it's neutrally buoyant, and then you like swim it up. And as you go from deep to shallow, the pressure is going to decrease, and so the air inside the bag is going to start expanding. So you have to like keep your hand on the release valve to like let air out as it expands, so it doesn't start floating away from you.
That's really
But
cool.
one of the exercises we did was just going down, and it would be attached to a weight.
Yeah.
And you take a breath, you dive down, and then you blow into the lift bag and you just take turns until it actually becomes neutrally buoyant. The person that makes it neutrally buoyant like swims up with it.
That's so cool. Yeah. There's a few things I'm gonna bring up right now. One random one before I forget. I listened to a like podcast with David Blaine, like the magician. Most kind of extremes of the human capability,
Yeah.
I listened to him on a podcast recently, and I didn't know. Apparently, in the last few years, he did one kind of. It's not like a trick, but yeah, like a experiment, I guess, like
illusion.
The one where he was like,
yeah,
how long he can not breathe. Yeah, and like I don't remember if he was underwater or like frozen in like in an ice cube or something. But
ice cube, yeah,
he didn't need to breathe, and he was saying how going through the training for that, apparently, like he was saying, like there's a huge misconception on the fact that people think you can't breathe for a long time. It's more like getting used to those lactic acid levels in your blood, or like the whichever levels in your blood. But so he had to do a bunch of like shallow, really shallow, like level, like kind of like water drowning, like. But yeah, it was just wild hearing him talk about it. But like, because I definitely thought it's only supposed to be like 3 or 4 minutes. You can't like breathe. But he's saying like, no, anybody can get to like a level of like 20, 30 minutes. You just have to get used to this.
Yeah, I know like when CO2 starts to build up in your lungs, it's what makes it like uncomfortable feeling.
Yeah. And it's like he was saying,
voluntary reaction.
But you can regulate, like, so you're like, the brain, like oxygen levels are okay and stuff. It was really wild hearing him talk about it. Back to one thing I forgot to ask from a while ago, you just said when you're talking about buoyancy, for those Argus floats, how do they regulate their buoyancy? Like how are they?
I have to look at the design. I know you can have like a bladder, like an air bladder that you can squeeze, to like change the density or the volume of that air bladder to change your buoyancy. That's how fish do it. But I'd have to look.
Yeah, because that's so interesting. That's something I've thought about, again, just thinking about like drones and how they would potentially do like really deep sea things. Is if you have to like create buoyancy in a state where you don't have any, if it'd be like a chemical reaction thing, because you can have like chemical reaction.
You can do chemical, yeah.
Blow it up.
It'd have to be something that's repeatable, many times. That's also very low energy, because you don't want, if you're going to be out there for a while, you don't want to have to like propel yourself.
Yeah.
And buoyancy is one of those things that you can do.
Yeah, it's so much more.
It's a pretty cheap way to get around.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, it's super cool thinking about the different mechanisms for buoyancy. I definitely would love to have. So, do you and Nick Nizuko? So you said you guys work in tandem.
Yeah.
I would love to talk to like both you guys and like him as well. But like get both these sides on it. That's so cool. All these sides of the drones are so cool. The science fiction end I've always tended to love. I just love the people that shoot for that, because someone's got to make it,
Yeah. So it's, any project is going to be a combination of a bunch of different disciplines, right? So you have to have the engineering, and I probably do a very small slice of it, where I kind of do a tiny bit on the engineering side, but mostly understanding the image processing, the like optics behind how to track different biological processes and physical processes with changes in light. And then doing some field experiments to kind of incorporate physiology. So
where would like, go ahead.
Oh, nothing. I'm done.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, like, this is something I always ask at the end anyway, in terms of kind of general everything we talked about over the podcast of like book recommendations, whether it's philosophical, fictional, whatever. But specifically in this topic, kind of that sense of not engineering basics, but like understanding that. Are there any thing like is there like any one resource you can point to that you got that from? Like it could be like a technical text, but like the way you're learn to understand light enough to understand what you can do with it in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, there actually is like an open access book if people are interested.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's something I'm definitely going to put like in the show notes. And yeah, if we can't find it now, we can totally, doesn't matter. I'll just include it in there for people to grab later.
Yeah. Let me
interesting.
look it up, and I could send you a link to some
Yeah,
text that might, maybe some more general
for
text,
sure. Yeah, like to get
and
it.
then some more technical ones if people are
Yeah,
interested in
exactly.
learning more
I feel
about
like
it.
with a lot of those random, and again, kind of why I wanted to like start this podcast was for anybody that wasn't technically taught in any of these disciplines, so they could kind of find a footing. Like that's to me one of the coolest things about podcasts is if you find a really good one. There's fewer technical ones out there. There's some I really like, but there are good podcasts out there that can teach you like principles and like really teach you a field enough to like eventually get involved, like to like make a difference in that field, like add something to it, like it
Yeah.
fundamentals and give you enough resources where you can then like read from those and then start doing work there. But yeah, that's something super cool to me. And for topics, some of the topics we talked about, there's if someone didn't know where to start with that, the only way would be like, oh, I had to go like get like a whole degree, which obviously is a great thing. But if let's say you want to do
Yeah, but it's not available to everybody,
or it's not available, yeah, like
Yeah.
it's very hard to find like resources on like using like the light spectrum to figure out how to do all these things or like what
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
how even just like people design drones or start engineering something, just the process. It's really hard to find resources sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I will send you a few, and you could kind of put them
For sure,
in
yeah.
the
I'm gonna put them
description.
all in the description for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool stuff, super cool stuff.
Great.
Where's something else? Oh, let's talk call to adventure now. That's
Okay.
one of my like when we started doing this podcast. There's some I basically bring it up every time now, but I love it too much to not. It seems like everybody you talk to that really loves the ocean and deals with anything involving the ocean, there's like it's very on the surface in their personality, that call to adventure aspect, like um, the need to the adventurer part, like the curiosity there, the passion there. To me, it's like seems to be like a subgroup of all people that's really present. Like there's like not one that I've talked to that doesn't have that. That's not like fired up by the stuff they're
Mm-hmm.
doing, which is a super cool thing to me. But yeah, are there any particular heroes that you had or like things that inspired you or yeah, even just like like if you ever think about that like call to adventure and the things that you do, like the ways you associate with it. Might be kind of a weird question, but if that sparks
Well, yeah, I grew up near the ocean. I wouldn't say that I was, I was at the beach a lot as a kid, but I wouldn't say that I was. Well, it's kind of funny because I look back through some of my old elementary school, like those papers, or like what do you want to be when you grow up?
yeah.
And I said a marine biologist, which is kind of funny. I was like, oh, I guess I actually did. It's like a kid, like I actually grew up to be a firefighter.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a path that
Uh-huh.
was straightforward. Like I kind of came back around to it almost by accident. Was interested in science the entire time, but I did sail a lot as a kid
That's something
in
super
high school.
cool. Yeah. I've always wanted to learn to sail or just.
And I was a sailing instructor as like a summer job throughout
Mhm.
high school. And so I've always been kind of familiar, at least somewhat comfortable with the water. I guess, heroes, or people that influenced you in the field, of course, all
They can be
of the,
fictional. Yeah, they
of
can be
the
totally
people
fictional.
I've worked with, have been influenced. I could say one of the more inspirational people that I have had come in contact with in marine biology was this um, guy named Rafe Sagarin.
Mhm.
Um, and he unfortunately passed away a few years ago um, at a with at a much too soon.
Mhm.
But he kind of embodied that kind of adventurer
Yeah.
more than most people in science I know. And he's written a couple books, and I'll put a link to.
Yeah, I would
I'll
love.
give you a link to one of
I would love.
his.
Yeah, just any link to him. Yeah, those books.
Yeah, he worked at University of Arizona um, in like the biosphere program, and he went to Stanford. Uh, he actually showed Bill Clinton around the tide pools at Hopkins
Yeah.
Marine Station at Stanford in the 90s. He was like, I met him through this. Every year we have this annual meeting called Western Society of Naturalists,
Mhm.
which happens in early November. This year it's going to be virtual. But he was the auctioneer. We have like a benefit auction to fund student travel.
What is the
And
group about?
it's marine ecology, mostly focused on the West Coast. So kind of like from Alaska down through Baja California.
Okay. Okay.
And it's very, you'll get a lot of kelp talks there. But, so it's basically just 15-minute talks that everybody comes and shares their research, or a topic of research in the past year. And then there's, we all have dinner together.
Mhm.
And we have an auction where people donate either, like actual items or like pieces of art they've made, and then or books, and then we auction those off, and then all that money goes to fund students to travel to the meeting every year. And last year it was actually in Ensenada in Baja California for the first time in like 25 years. So it was a lot of fun to go down to Mexico.
Mhm.
I spent a lot of time in Baja for my master's, and I grew up very close to the border. I was born in Imperial Beach, California, and
Okay.
you could see the border fence from where I was born and where I grew
Wow.
up.
Okay. Yes. Yes.
So, and I've spent a lot of time in Mexico, so I have a pretty close connection and respect for Mexico and the border areas and the people. But yeah. So I met Rafe, and during my master's when I started going to that meeting, and he was
Oh
pretty
yeah.
influential in me making the choice to do my PhD.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's so cool to me. Just that like that the kinds of people that want that feeling of being on the on the open ocean, or like that like freedom feeling. There's definitely an air to it, or like that
Yeah. There's always a sense of
have a job where you can do that.
adventure and
People
danger,
around.
and a novel environment, right?
Yeah.
It's ever changing. It changes quickly. It's never still,
Yeah.
rarely still. So it's
There's always
always
curious
it's
people.
always exciting being out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it just translates to like, yeah, I guess all those aspects are probably all the same thing. They're just really curious people,
Mm-hmm.
But it's really
And
cool.
a person to look up.
Oh yeah.
Uh, so let me make sure I get the name right. So Nansen. Nansen's Fram is a really cool story. So I was talking about upwelling
Mhm.
and why that works. It's this process called Ekman transport. And one of the people that it's named after Ekman, who did the math for Ekman transport. So if you think of like basically kind of like a layers of a cake, and so the surface wind is blowing water, and then that's going to move. The water's going to want to move the same direction as the wind, right? But then the Coriolis force turns it, and it's going to actually blow at about 45-degree angle, like right on the surface to the actual direction of the wind, and then the layer below that is going to be pushed by the surface layer of the water, and then it's going to turn more.
45.
And so basically it kind of spirals down. So as you go to different layers that are being pushed, it keeps turning more due to Coriolis force, and that's called like the Ekman spiral. And the mean direction of that is 90 degrees to the wind. And that is Ekman transport.
So
and that's what causes
upwelling. Go basically 90 degrees from the wind.
If you take the average across all the layers, it's 90 degrees, but it actually spirals around because the surface water is pulling on the water, pulling the water below it.
It's not really being affected by the layer above it in terms of push.
And one of the people that kind of figured out that this was happening was this guy named Nansen, and this is back in the 1800s, I think, maybe early 1900s, and late 1893 to 1896, and he built this special boat. He was trying to reach the North Pole, and he built this special boat that could be locked in ice, so it was strong and it could get locked in ice. And he had noticed that the ice moves, right? And this is due to the Ekman transport, which hadn't really been discovered at the time. So he theorized that he could make it to the North Pole if he sailed up to the Arctic Circle. The boat got locked in ice during the winter, and then as the ice moved, due to the Ekman transport, it would take him closer to the North Pole. And then when he got close enough, just by living in the boat with this group of research team, he would take off and make it to the North Pole. And he did this for like 3 years trying to get to it. So pretty much imagine being like locked in ice for 3 years, waiting, trying to get to the North Pole.
Does it work like that? Does it really take you? Does it kind of like circle in?
Yeah, he didn't quite make it to the exact point. But you can look up on maps and follow the track of like where his boat went. And he also won the Nobel Peace Prize later in life for refugee work. And he was a pretty dynamic person.
Cool guy.
Like in all fields of life, right?
Yeah, that's so cool. That's something I've heard a couple of people I really love talk about it, but something that I hope there's like a resurgence of in the modern age is like the curious generalists that kind of like, I'm a very big believer in the fact that I think most people drastically overestimate or underestimate how many things you can do in your life, like overestimate how long it takes to do something. Like even if it was something as specific as like attacking a whole other field, like becoming a biologist or becoming a computer scientist or whatever, if with like focused effort, like if you're like becoming obsessed with something and really like directly that's all you're trying to do, I don't think it takes more than 5 to 10 years max, like really 5 is my personal belief, to become someone great at that thing. Like, you're not number one, but you'll probably be like within the top 5% if you're really going crazy, and just the fact that you can do so many more things in your life, or like a human being can, than most people think. And people like that guy and like Benjamin Franklin and like just kind of the system of old, which was like through your life you kind of just let yourself get interested in and get into all these different disciplines and understand them all pretty well. Like that's something I think is like missing, like whenever the age of specialization came. But I love any people that embody that. Really cool in history. So cool.
Yeah, it's pretty drives, can give you some drive, and is
and it's so much, and like the fact that like it's so much easier to do today than any day of old because you have all the information.
It's got information right here.
Like, there's so many people like I know there's like I really don't remember it really enough to know the phrasing, but like some like proverb thing from like Aristotle times, where it's like first like a man is like, first you're young, then you like go to like your war phase because everyone has to do that, and then you or kind of in the political phase, and you're like in your like thinker and like philosopher phase. But there's like you have like everyone does all these things. You don't just pick one. It's like that's the like everyone has
Yeah.
stages, and now it'd be so much easier to go through these phases and learn different things if you wanted to, but no one does, or most don't.
Yeah. No, I think that's important to keep in mind, especially like what you were saying, are specialized.
Yeah. Anyway, I prefer that approach. Again, just back to there's too many things I want to learn out there, and it's cool getting to put them together. I don't think,
So there's a lot of like free education, available now.
Yeah.
Like I know MIT and I think Stanford are making all of their courses.
Yeah, that's so
online for free. So the knowledge, getting taught by the best people is I mean, and everybody's online now, right? So like, or almost everybody, So I mean, at UCSB, all our undergrads are all remote learning right now. So I think that there's positives to having in-person classes, especially certain classes, but I think that having those resources out there really is a great thing, especially for people that can't that live all around the world, or people that have to work and don't have the time or money to or the ability to take on that debt to go to school. So there's nothing, you shouldn't let a piece of paper that you get at the end of you shouldn't let you shouldn't let trying to get not having a degree from taking classes stop you, because at the end of the day, like there's a lot of great people that never got a degree, right?
Yeah, it's super cool. I heard even like recently, I don't remember if it was on their podcast or just a talk that this professor gave. I think he was from MIT, but he was talking about like the way he sees it. Again, there's some things that are obviously way better in person, and you kind of need some in-person aspect, but in so many, like the biggest part of most fields, he thinks in the future it's going to be like education is going to be commoditized. So like if that there are like maybe like 5 or 10 people like that are like the Richard Feynmans of their field that just explain it better than anybody.
Yeah.
And you get a really good lecture series of them explaining it. Like that should be the only one people really need to get, like that it would make it so much cheaper for people to get like scale that to every like level of teaching any field. Like he thinks it's going to break down to like being a few people teaching at each level that teach it the best, and like the whole world kind of having access to their version. So it's not like every school has like 20 history teachers. There's like a history program that's like shared, that's like of a really good
I mean, I think for making it accessible, especially for like general classes, obviously things would have to be updated as new depending on the field, how quickly the field's changing. But there's some really great teachers. There's a great astronomy teacher at Berkeley.
It's an interesting thing to think about, like if there was a system like that, or if everything switched to something like that.
Yeah, or at least having something like that available to everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Back to Nansen real quick. How did he get out? Like, how does he get out of the ice at the end? When he's
I think he eventually he got, let me see, actually. I think he eventually made it to an island. Franz Joseph Lind to Cape Flora. Oh, and then he drifted again. I'm gonna have to reread the story about how he got out. I know how he got in. But whether he eventually dislodged from the ice.
How's the guy gonna get out of the ice?
Yeah, it sounded like quite an adventure, but probably a long, many dark days sitting in this one ship locked in ice.
Yeah.
With like 5 of your 10 of your best friends.
Yeah, you basically just like made a little house on an ice shelf that you're like riding.
Yeah.
There's just something so cool about that. I love the craziness of it. One thing,
Yeah.
how much time do you have? I don't want to take too much of your time.
I should probably get going in the next 5 to 10 or
Oh,
so.
okay.
I have to go and um, five. Have to go and return some my field equipment from yesterday
Gotcha.
back to
Yeah,
the
no worries.
lab.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of some. There's a few other things. Hopefully, we can talk some other time soon. I'm having a great.
Sure.
Um, yeah, I'm trying to think of which ones wouldn't take that long. I definitely want to. I mean, I guess we can just touch on it. But you work with like Google Earth, like the engine and like the coding you do there,
Mm-hmm.
like the scripts you like wrote so you can do better imaging. Um, when did you start on that side of work? Like, how did you get started with that?
Well, the process, the actual code, or the kind of like the processing steps for the image. So the kind of what we've been doing with the Google Earth Engine is so Google Earth Engine, I should probably explain it first, is from it's different than Google Earth. So it's basically a cloud-based repository of satellite imagery and different geospatial products that sit on servers at Google. And so basically, you can write code, write scripts to process that satellite imagery, just like I have in the past, and use Google's servers and computing power
Mhm.
to accomplish those tasks. So you're basically just sending instructions to
Yeah, I
them
never knew they
to
had
do
that
this work.
repository, and it's like open and free to.
Yeah, and so what's like I use Landsat satellites a lot to look at kelp canopy dynamics, and you know, I've basically ordered and downloaded those images from USGS, US Geological Survey,
Mhm.
um, and process them on either my personal machine at the university or on some like cluster computing at our institute. Um, but it requires me storing the image, which can be between 500 megabytes to a gigabyte each, and storing the output products and using our computers to process the imagery. And so the thing that Google Earth Engine does is it basically downloads all that imagery for you. It keeps them on a server. So you just basically point it at what file you want to run.
Mhm.
And there's a visualization platform too, so you can kind of examine the imagery. And then, they will process it and then send you the output products. And it's pretty interesting. I think there's both Python and JavaScript APIs,
Mhm.
neither of which are my preferred language that I'm most comfortable in, but I've basically learned some JavaScript to translate the code, that existing code we had, into
Mhm.
Google Earth Engine. And we're in the process of basically converting most of what we're doing at what we had been doing on local machines to Google Earth Engine.
Mhm. That's super cool. Yeah, I'll definitely ask you a bunch more about that next time.
And how I learned, there's actually a great series of labs and YouTube videos from this lab in Australia, which is how I learned. I just searched on YouTube and found these, and I could also send you the links to these. So
For sure.
basically, there's the lectures that he gives for the labs are on YouTube, and then you can follow along at his website, and he has all the code to like help get you going. So like, hey, here's how to like access an image. Here's how to access an image set. Here's how
Yeah.
to, you know, um, run some basic vegetation indices. Here's how to make a time series. Here's how to mask out clouds, stuff like that. And you can kind of like take those little examples and start putting them together to build something you're interested
Yeah.
in.
That's so cool. Yeah, I can't wait to talk about that way more in depth. Um, last real question. What are
Sure.
you most excited about technology wise, or just what are you most excited about for the future in terms of your work or just things happening in the oceans, things happening with tech related to any of those areas? Is there something on the horizon that you just like can't wait till it's here? Doesn't have to be like super soon. It could be like something you think is going to exist in like 5 years. But yeah, are there any things like that for you?
Um,
And on an
you
exciting.
know, I guess personally, in regards to drones, they're getting better. Like the vehicles are getting better every day.
Mm-hmm.
They're getting cheaper every day. The sensors that go along with them are getting better. We're probably going to buy this sensor that just came out. It's like a 10 band multispectral sensor. It's like two 5-band sensors together. What I'm really interested in the future, though, long term, is having like a monitoring network of autonomous vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like how I was explaining with
The
like a
dock.
drone platform docking. And what really is important for that to occur is there needs to be some changes in regulation.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, to fly a drone in a commercial or scientific setting, it's under Part 107 of the FAA. And one of the requirements of that, is keeping your pilot has to be within visual sight of the drone, which means that while it is like a somewhat autonomous way of doing work, you always have to be out there with it, watching
I
it.
didn't know about
And
any of these regulations. Yeah.
yeah, and you have to do that for recreational flight too. You have to
Uh-huh.
always keep it in eyesight, which is important because you don't want to have any potential interactions with aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
Legally, where drones should be only at a height of 400 feet or about 120 meters. That's our maximum altitude. Planes should always be above 500 unless you're near an airport. We have this technology already with most commercial drones where they won't even take off if you're too close to an airport.
Mm-hmm.
But and we do some of the newer drones we have tell you if an aircraft is approaching and tell you its altitude, its direction, shows you on a map where it's coming from. But I think really improving the technology and regulations and knowledge around how we're going to manage drones in airspace, or if there's regions that are going to be kind of like drone hotspots that are noted to pilots so they know that don't go under 500 feet, because I'll be flying and there will be small planes that, especially over the ocean, which is kind of like the Wild West, go down under 400 feet. And helicopters are always pretty low too.
Mm-hmm.
And so I never really had any close calls, but it's something that I wish there would be a little bit more
Better system.
that we should get better in the future, and that would allow us to do things like true repeated monitoring of ecosystems that like whether it's a reserve monitoring. I was out at this Carpentry Salt Marsh yesterday. It'd just be nice to have daily or weekly maps, drone maps, and we can really get that we can learn a lot about the ecosystem. But right now, it requires us to be out there, us to have an observer to make sure there's no planes for safety issues, which are important. But I think there's some common sense regulations we can do in the future that would make.
Yeah. And it's going to be exciting when the automation and like that AI and just gets good enough or the regulation trusted enough where trusting enough to know when anything is coming and like go on a route.
The pieces are all there. We just have
exactly. They're not
together, Yeah.
But awesome. And that's an awesome place to end it. If people are more interested in any of this in your work specifically, is there anywhere you'd want them to reach out to like websites?
Well, I guess I have a personal website, which is my kind of like current lab website. It's just tomwbell.net.
Mm-hmm.
So tomwbell.net.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's my contact information on there. You could read all my publications are linked on my page. So people can have access to them. There's not going to be any paywalls in between. Most academic journals are kind of in these pay, it's unless they're open access, they're hard to get, but all of mine are available there. So if you're interested in anything I said today or have questions about anything, welcome emails.
Perfect. Well, yeah, I had the best time. A bunch of the stuff was super interesting. I hope we can talk again anytime soon.
Sure.
But yeah, I hope you have an awesome day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much.